Morning. We are about to make this a historic event. Okay, the red light's blinking. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to 1455's monthly author event. Our special guest for April is Gina Frangello. I'm Sean Murphy. If you are a friend of ours and you're joining us again, thank you for coming back. If this is your first time, very short and sweet. 1455 is a nonprofit literary organization. Our mission is very simple. We celebrate creativity and we try to build and promote community. We are in love with storytelling and live for it. So all of our programming is dedicated towards celebrating storytelling and storytellers. And this event tonight is part of a series. We've got a lot of other stuff. And if you're inclined to check us out, you can find out all kinds of info at 1455litarts.org. And I will put information and links in the eventual write-up on our blog and on our Facebook page. And I'll put tons of information about how you can buy Gina's books and find out more about her. But it truly does take a village to celebrate the arts, which I think is a great thing. So as always, I'm very happy to be in partnership with our good friends at the historic DC institution, the Potter's House. And Talia Jaffe is here tonight, my partner in crime. Talia, I would love you to say a few words about yourself and the amazing work you and your team do at the Potter's House.
Thank you so much, Sean. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Talia Jaffe, the Events and Operations Manager here at the Potter's House. We are delighted to have you all here and to welcome Gina here, especially tonight. Before we begin, a few quick announcements. First of all, as always, a quick plug to share for those of you that don't know. The Potter's House is a nonprofit social enterprise. We're a bookstore, cafe, and event space, and we've been serving up radical hospitality in Adams Morgan since 1960. We're currently open for takeout and book browsing from 8:30 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. daily. During these hours, we offer a free warm meal and cup of coffee to anyone who needs, no questions asked. So if you or someone you know are in need of a free meal, please send them our way. Second, this Saturday is Independent Bookstore Day. We're extending our hours for one day only, and we're giving away free coffee with the purchase of any book. There's going to be a 30% off sale on a large section of our store. We're giving away some other indie bookstore exclusive freebies and much, much more. You can find out more at pottershousedc.org/events, but we hope to see you anytime on Saturday from 8:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. All of that being said, hosting conversations with authors like Gina is one of our favorite things to do as a small independent bookstore. We're especially thrilled to have Gina with us here this evening because, as many others have said in the reviews of her recently published book, this work in and of itself is a huge act of generosity. I'm so excited for you to experience the intimacy and risks and generous truth that Frangello has gifted us with tonight. You can purchase your own copy of Blow Your House Down from our bookshop.org storefront. I'll drop the link in the events comment momentarily. Again, thank you all for joining us, and to Gina and Sean, thank you in advance for what I know will be an incredibly meaningful dialogue.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our pleasure, Talia. Thank you so much. Rock on. All right, let's get down to it. Let me first introduce our author tonight, which is my extraordinary pleasure. And I've shortened her bio, as I tend to do, because we talk to such amazing writers. We could spend the whole hour just reading her achievements. So I'll make sure to put the full bio in the write-up, but here's the abbreviated version. Gina Frangello is the author of 4 books in fiction, in addition to the memoir that we're going to discuss this evening, Blow Your House Down, a story of family, feminism, and treason. Her novel, A Life in Men, is currently under development by Charlize Theron's production company, Denver and Delilah. Wow. She has nearly 20 years of experience as an editor, and her short fiction, essays, book reviews, and journalism have been widely published in too many places to count. Gina lives mainly in Chicago and occasionally in the California desert with her family and 3 gluttonous cats. Gina, thank you for taking time off from your rock'em sock'em balls to the wall promotional effort and extraordinary splash that this incredible memoir is making.
Thank you. I'm doing so many events that my head is on fire. So I live in this chair, and I'm really grateful, and it's awesome. Thank you for having me.
Well, I've really been looking forward to this. And, I'll say that if I'm not mistaken, this is at minimum our third time sharing virtual screen space, because we did a author series in the fall for the amazing anthology Alone Together, which you're featured in. And we talked with a bunch of other great authors. And then you did the 1455 interview late fall, early winter.
Right,
and It's just crazy how time flies, because we were talking about the imminent release of the memoir, which is now here, which I have read and am dying to discuss. So I want to kick it off just by saying my 2 cents. I've got a lot more to say, but I think one of the big gifts I think this book gives to the reader is that we learn so many things about you as we read along throughout the narrative. We learn about Gina, the writer, of course, but then we learn about Gina, the human being, which contains multitudes. That includes Gina, the daughter, Gina, the mother, Gina, the wife, Gina, the ex-wife, the adulterous Gina, the friend, the close friend Gina, and friend to others, the mother, and the increasingly fulfilled Gina, who's achieved wisdom the hardest and most genuine way possible, and remains, like all special people, a work in progress. So that's how I would tee this up. I want to congratulate you on the success. I'm happy to add my trumpet to the fanfare. It's really reaching a divergent, passionate audience for all the right reasons. I think we predicted this when I was reading it. I knew it was going to make a splash, but it's just delightful to see good work find a good audience. Talk about your experience thus far, because now we got you in the pregame, and now we've got you in the game is going on. But talk a little bit about what's been going on with you.
It's been great. Obviously, so you don't get to travel around on a book tour right now. But the great thing is that I've still been able to talk to some of my favorite writers all over the country on virtual events. So I've done a couple events with my business partner and very close friend, Emily Rapp Black, but I've also just tried to team up with writers who I admire and respect and just adore, who I hardly ever get to talk to and see, like Joanna Rakoff and Lacey Crawford. So it's been great. And today I actually was able to go to Women and Children First Bookstore, which is my first time in an actual bookstore, to sign stock. And it was crazy fun because, they had some that were in reserve and so forth. And they said, not just signing the ones on the shelves, but sign these ones that people have already ordered and are going to pick up. They had the names on the spine, just the last name. And a bunch of them were people I knew. So I got to personalize a bunch of books because I'm in my hometown, and it was joy.
That's great. And Gina, I think, you are another wonderful example of what I would say, we all, I think no one wants to hear writers or artists complain about the tough times, although they're very genuine, because everyone this past year has had an extraordinary challenge on so many levels. But that being said, with due empathy and awareness, I think a lot of us held our breath a year or so ago thinking, man, we're not going to be able to connect, and we're not going to be able to do what the things we've done. And I think a huge silver lining is that in some ways we've rallied as a community and within our micro communities. And I would say, speaking just for myself, but also from what I've seen, we're closer than ever because everyone's helping lift each other up and recognizing that if we can't meet in bookstores for signings, well, damn it, we can do virtual events, and we can use social media, which is used so awfully, so much of the time. It can be used for good. And I think we've seen that in the artistic community, and your success, I think, would have been guaranteed in an old world. But certainly I've loved seeing, mentions of you ricocheting around and seeing the positive ways people can do something as simple as sharing a review or an interview, because that makes a big difference.
Well, you were just talking about, Jen and Alone Together. And I don't know if you've heard, but they've raised $40,000 at this point for indie booksellers. It's been amazing. I was so honored to be part of that project. And so, yeah, things are happening, things that might not have happened otherwise.
Awesome. Well, I feel like between the positioning of the 1455 interview tonight and then maybe by our Summerfest, we'll have the complete, which of course, once a book goes out, the story never ends, it goes on. But I do love the idea of we're catching you while you're still en fuego. and it'll be fun to talk, several months from now when we've returned, I think, to a more normal. I think we're edging toward normalcy, and it'll be neat to hear, how we all kind of reintegrate into the old-fashioned publishing scene. But let's get down to brass tacks. I've got so many things I want to talk to you about. I think the best way to start, because it's such a provocative title, or I should say the subtitle. I mean, Burn Your House Down is a brilliant title, very, very appropriate, but a story of family, feminism, and treason. So for those who've yet to experience this memoir, talk a bit about the import of those three words in particular and how it relates to the material.
So, Blow Your House Down it's a memoir, but it's also kind of hybrid cultural criticism. And so it examines really the roles that women have occupied in psychiatry, in medicine, in law, in various different systems throughout history. And I use my own life as a bit of a lens towards looking at that. And one of the many facets, and I thank you for kind of pointing out all the different threads of the book. One of the facets is, of course, that I have an extramarital affair, and so I look at the role of like the adulteress throughout history. I have been a lifelong feminist since I was 11 years old, since I was living in a neighborhood where that was not part of the vernacular. It was like the neighborhood feminism forgot. And I know there are many such neighborhoods in small towns that, all over the country where people could say that. But I picked it up from books. I picked it up from television. I was passionate about it. I never would shut up about it in 6th grade. And I had this sort of very clear, unquestioned vision of what that meant to be a feminist. And I really later complicated that vision in many, many ways. Most of them were in many ways of my own making, but also things imposed from the outside as well. So I think the treason part of it has to do, of course, with the way that we essentially often equate sexual indiscretion on the part of women with, really just with sort of the biggest wrongs that a person can do in humanity. And while I actually think that, of course, there's truth to that on an individual level, in the sense of you're hurting another person and sometimes an entire system of people, I do think that the sexual strictures on women throughout history, and even now, particularly at this point in history, mothers, middle-aged women, women of color, queer women, younger women, I think, have gotten a certain amount of leeway that maybe they didn't have before, nowhere close to what should be, but
Right.
a bit more than other populations. And so the treason part was both looking at the ways that I had betrayed my own feminist principles, but also looking at the ways that kind of messy humanity is viewed as treasonous on the part of women and certain women. So that was the subtitle. And of course the book is about family, so that's that word. There's my parents play major roles in the book, very, very big characters in the book, and so forth.
Yeah, so I just a few quick words. This really resonated with me on the level, well, on a lot of levels. But I'm a still recovering grad student, and I came of age during the time when cultural studies was absolutely ascendant. So I had a special appreciation for the ways that you really seamlessly and strategically weaved in, kind of a cultural critique of feminism, cultural critique of society, and both kind of the female gaze and the way females are gazed at. And we're going to get into that a little bit more, but extra appreciation. And to be able to do that, Gina, you're obviously a writer of some experience, because I don't think, never mind the subject matter and the material itself, but I don't think a younger writer would be able to have the expertise to pull that off without either being very heavy-handed or, using jargon as a kind of a show off, or, like you really have this balance that I don't think you strive for. It doesn't feel forced, but because of your writing experience, you just instinctively were able to, lay it on and know the exact quote at the right time to make your point. So I would say to anyone listening now that's thinking, wait, criticism and it's not a jargon heavy, book. It's very readable. It's very relatable, but it's heavier than, frankly, and I'm not going to offer any examples of the opposite, but it's not a narcissistic navel gazing exercise. It really struggles to engage with a whole history of feminist writing, which is really remarkable achievement.
Thank you. Thank you.
So with that being said, how's that for a tee up for the author to read a section so we can get a little taste of what this book is all about?
So I'm actually, because the first chapter, which is called The Story of A, has been printed in full, both on LitHub and in the New York Times, and people can access that. And that is definitely, I open the book with kind of a cultural criticism bang. In a sense, I feel like you have to give your reader a bit of a template of what to expect from you, in a sense. And so while the book then does become more narrative and more personal from that point on, in a way, I wanted people who were like, nah, not of interest to me to know that right off the bat. But so I'm not going to read from that. I'm not going to read anything theoretical at all. I'm going to read a little bit about my parents, because I have discovered that I like reading about my parents because I miss my parents. My father died in 2015 and my mother in 2019. And in this section, it's from a chapter called What Women Do. And my mother has been in a car accident that my daughters were also in the car with her at the time. And she has had, her leg has been shattered in like 3 places. She's in and out of all these different medical facilities. And so I am taking care of my father, who lives downstairs from me. I'm starting just in the middle of it.
Okay.
With my mother in and out of hospitals, rehabs, and nursing homes, between managing her care, looking after my increasingly weak and unstable father, and mothering 3 children, 2 of whom I fear daily will never love me again after what I've done, I fall behind in every manner of work. My business partner at the press is in the early stages of the longest and most contentious divorce I've ever witnessed, and I am turning myself inside out to try to avoid the same fate, while paradoxically all but ignoring my husband. And both she and I are starting to fail miserably in our professional obligations. I barely spend time with my children because I'm always rushing off to do something for one or the other of my sick and depressed parents. My parents, especially my mother, have been co-raisers of the children, have maybe spent more time with them than their father has, given that he works 12 or 13-hour days, moving up the ladder, supporting us, being all the things he believes a man should be. I can still hear my daughters squealing "Nana" every morning when my mother would come upstairs for coffee before they started school. But it is around this time, my father verging on some precipice of psychosis and dementia, my mother morose and bedridden in a disinfectant smelling assisted living facility, that the kids begin to tune out, to avoid my parents, who seem to have become new and alarming versions of themselves overnight, even if in truth this has been progressing for years. We are all new and scarier versions of ourselves lately, except, of course, my youngest. What used to feel like magic, like a shimmering gold of extended family and dreams come true, is gone. And instead, I now essentially have 5 dependents and a husband I'm doing my best to avoid. Like my parents' doctor, the other moms at my daughter's school apparently find my life so chaotic, even from the outside, even not knowing half of the train wreck I've created, that one attempts to organize a meal train for me and my family. But this makes me so profoundly uncomfortable that I refuse to allow it. I keep saying things like, it's not like I'm going through chemo. I keep saying how they should save these kinds of community efforts for, quote, people who really need them. What I don't say but mean, this is my penance, and I cannot allow you to lift it from me. In literary tradition, as well as the mythology of most major religions, it is common to kill off children as a symbol of their parents' crimes. I do not believe in divine retribution or karma or any kind of God or fate that takes a sentient interest in the happenings of our world. But what I know, there are circumstances that unearth you irrevocably, that break you, that leave you never again an unbroken whole. My daughters could have died in that car. They could have contracted head injuries that would have changed their futures. They could have come away never walking again. Whenever I long for my lover's touch, which is always, I play the could have been game to force myself into a fearful gratitude. My father's ulcer could have waited just long enough to rear its head so that he would have been deployed overseas and died in his tank on some European battlefield, in which case he would never have met my mother. I could have never been born, leaving my youngest to non-existence and my daughters to be adopted from China by some entirely other people. Maybe they would be born again Christians in Naperville right now, immersed in Suzuki piano lessons and nowhere near my mother's car or Costco on the night of that accident. Or maybe the referral to some could have been other adoptive family would have waited 1 month, 2 months longer, and one of my fierce, inextricable twins could have contracted some bug and died in a Chinese orphanage before her first birthday, leaving the other to live life as a single, not remembering that she'd ever had a sister. But instead of any of that happening, here they all are, my family, for me to tend. Compared to the alternate realities that could have happened, how can I want for anything more in this one? I let my daughters down. They were entrusted to me and I hurt them. I made them cry. I made them frightened and unhappy and burdened. I violated their trust and then I almost lost them. If scrubbing my father's blood could remove just the slightest bit of blood on my hands, I will do it forever. And nobody should be allowed to send me a meal train as consolation. I do not deserve a meal train. I don't deserve anything. When you hate yourself enough, there is a sharp tinge of satisfaction in unhappiness. I hope you're taking care of yourself, one of the would-be meal train moms keeps saying. Ever since I've known you, it's been one thing after another with your parents, your miscarriage, your friend Kathy. It never lets up. She is a good friend, but when she talks this way, I want to slap her face. Her parents lost a child, and she of all people should know how inconsequential my trials have been. Maxine Hong Kingston writes that in Chinese tradition, sometimes mothers would loudly proclaim their children ugly or stupid so that no harm would befall them, so that the ghosts would not think them worthy of stealing. I keep my head down. I watch my life shrinking by degree into the maw of need, children, parents, parents, children. Instead of resisting, I hurl myself into the contradiction, the blood. Move along, I tell the ghosts of guilt who ricochet around my brain, who may be eyeing my children for the sacrificial altar for my crimes. There is nothing exciting here to see. Please don't take them from me.
Wow. First of all, thank you for sharing that. It's always special when you've read a book to hear the author reading her own words. So that's very special. And well, I don't think there's any passage that you could have read that wouldn't tee up my next question, but that's particularly appropriate because I want to talk about this. This is not an original or profound observation, but I do think that one thing of many that separates serious writers from the hacks is an almost congenital inability to not be honest. And honesty can become, I think, like an aesthetic rabbit hole where once you can't be half honest. And there's such a penetrating honesty. And I think this the section you just read, it is kind of almost this onion of, and that pulls in your intelligence and sensitivity, this obvious critical theory, this inability to let any kind of comment lay without immediately deconstructing it and turning it back on itself. And am I asking for pity? No, let me pile it on. And one of the things that reminded me of in a very powerful way was actually Dostoevsky, because he was one of the first kind of psychological realists. But in like Notes from Underground, you have this narrator that's he almost can't get the words out because he's constantly doubling back and questioning and saying, well, maybe that's not true. And I felt that energy. But I feel like this memoir, Gina, is so honest, so searing, and so at times self-lacerating. It becomes almost heroic. I know you wouldn't want anyone to say that, but I'm allowed to say that as a reader and critic. But talk a little bit about, if you care to, how you perceive the notion of, aside from the obvious, like, well, you want to write something meaningful, you need to be honest with the reader, but taking it a little bit deeper and how the notion of extreme honesty applies to this writing.
So, well, first of all, Dostoevsky was my mother's favorite writer, so that was interesting. Brothers Karamazov was her favorite book. But so I have a lot of things to say about that, because about that question of honesty, and that question of, I guess, intensity, and the onion spooling of, constant the deconstruction of one idea and the analysis and so forth. My long-term best friend, who has known me since I was 10, sometimes says that if she had to live for 5 minutes inside my brain, she would have an aneurysm. So that's what my mind works like, and it's where I was able to go in writing creative nonfiction, in ways that I haven't always been able to go when I was writing fiction. Um, that being said, so before I go really kind of into that, because I think that, I have a lot of feelings about intensity of writing. But I also feel really strongly about the fact that, sometimes when your writing is very intense and you've gone very deeply into certain things that may be somewhat taboo, or that maybe, are somewhat unconventional, there is this idea that that the book is almost like, oh, it's no holds barred. You've revealed everything, like you cut your skin open and stepped out. And what I believe in, I think, is that if you're going to go to a place, if you're going to include it, you want to go. Like, you want to go, you want to write from the inside out. You want to really make the reader feel what it is like to be inside your skin and behind your eyes, and not an observer from the outside. But I also feel like particularly it's so important for women who are writing memoir to hear, like, including from writers like myself, who are, who are often called like raw or naked and, et cetera, that a book is always a curated piece of art. It's always, I've been saying this at a lot of events, but it's kind of like, it's that little tip of the iceberg that is visible above the water. And I think that, no matter how naked you're being about certain things, no matter how self-examining you're being about certain things, we are all still entitled to aspects of our lives that are private. And that intensity of writing does not require you to now just completely make yourself a public object of consumption. So I think what it does require is an ability to accept that you are not always going to look good. In fact, maybe you'll seldom look good. And I think that that's something that most literary writers who are writing fiction have long ago understood, right? That your protagonist has to be a really flawed, messy character. Like Janet Burroway says in her craft book, in fiction, only trouble is interesting. And trouble that comes from the inside tends to be more interesting than, like, say, lightning strikes your house and you just had bad luck. So I felt it was really necessary to approach myself as I would a fictional character, in the sense that I wasn't going to sit there and wring my hands about how can I bring the reader back around to being on my side, or make me, make them like me. I've never spent 5 seconds thinking about that when writing a novel, which maybe, whatever, side note, maybe why I'm an indie writer, but I've never been interested in writing the kind of like inspirational heroine who, just overcomes adversity. Like, I'm interested in people who make a lot of their own adversity. And so for me, a lot of that was just being able to finally take that step back and be like, now that's you. You're the one doing that. There you are. Show it.
Yeah, and Gina, thank you for that. And I think that denotes, it's a respect for the reader, right? And I'm also glad it gives me the opportunity to really put a fine point on what I was hoping to articulate, which is to be clear to those of you watching. I'm certainly not suggesting that this book, she lays it all out there. In fact, it's the opposite of that. The real craft, and I've talked to a lot of writers about this when it pertains to memoir, is the mistaken notion that you write as therapy, or that you write and if you can inoculate yourself by saying, but it all is the truth. It's like, yeah, but you owe it to the reader to make it interesting, and you owe it to the reader to have worked through what could be cut and what is superfluous or what doesn't resonate, so that what's on the page is tough and serves its purpose. So this really is a finely crafted kind of diamond, where by no means is this sprawling mess of emotion. It's very deliberate, and again pulls in it. You just have the ability, when it is getting really intense, you kind of can take your foot off the accelerator and break in with some critical theory and vice versa. So the pacing is good. You also just talked about, and I'm very glad you did, and I welcome much more of it. I would be the first to say, especially like as a straight white male, I would recommend this book to any woman. But I want to get my just 2 cents in, very genuine in saying that, yeah, of course, I would more easily recommend this book, or I would more urgently recommend this book to a woman that might really benefit from your courage and resilience. But I think this is a very important book for men to read, because we're in this moment of Me Too, which we'd all agree is overdue, is necessary, is good, but it's like, that's the first floor of a very tall building we need to get to. And for me, the thing that men, I think, need to really understand is that even when women aren't being watched, which is laden with issues, the notion of women being watched by men, even when they're not being watched, they're watching themselves. And that's something that so many men probably don't have to grapple with. But reading a book like this, we're elevating awareness and we're elevating empathy, but we're getting closer, I think, to solidarity. And I think that's what's really necessary for things like Me Too to go from slogan to making the world that we want to see. So, again, of course, I would never say, well, it's really a book for women, but I want to hammer that point home that in some very important ways, I think this is a book for men.
I agree. I think, it's sort of like I became obsessed with the Neapolitan quartet, Elena Ferrante's My Brilliant Friend, et cetera, et cetera. And all the smart women I knew were obsessed with her. And none of the men I knew had read her. And I was on a panel with Sasha Heyman, and he was extolling how amazing she was. But I essentially felt like, yes, women are reading those novels and feeling an enormous sense of recognition. Something's being tapped into, a level of depth is being tapped into that is rarely found in even great novels. And she was giving that to women. But I also felt like if a man wanted to understand the experience of being a woman, now obviously there's no one experience, but it was one of the most deep psychological dives into womanhood and girlhood as well that I'd ever read. And so I went around recommending them to every man I knew, because I was like, well, yeah, we are all going to see ourselves and we're all going to be thrilled and excited, but you all are the ones who have not had this experience, and this is going to get you as close to a certain type of female experience as you can get on the page. And so I wanted that too.
Yeah, and I had the extraordinary pleasure and privilege to be on a panel earlier in the week talking to some great writers, that we were talking about kind of the tension between writing political work. And one of the things we talked about, I think we all agreed on, I think most writers would agree, is that the thing that art can and should do that political writing can't do is make its points through stories. And so we're talking about, say, climate change or feminism in this case. You could read a very compelling document with statistics, and a certain type of person would see that and the message would be received. But I think for a lot of people, for a variety of reasons, especially in contemporary society, it's easy to tune out because it's statistics and it's fact and it's science.
Right, absolutely.
So that's another reason why I would say a book like this is doing the service of giving people that maybe are willing to be educated an opportunity to get into someone's skin. And I think by virtue of a book like this, of course you're telling your story, but you're also telling a story. I mean, again, as a white male, I've nursed a sick, dying mother. Like any reader that has any experience in life is going to commiserate on some level. So I think that's also important to point out, that there's the shared experience that everyone's going to bring their own baggage. But again, where I think we've had this resurgence of different types of memoirs, different types of art, it's all in the service of, I mean, it's not written politically, but it doesn't hurt the cause. It's just a different way of maybe bringing some people aboard where they would be resistant otherwise.
Absolutely. I mean, they've done studies that show that literature increases empathy, and I mean, I like essays that have statistics and so forth, but it's like there's a difference between imparting information and making people feel something. And so, I tried to straddle the line a bit in this book, but I definitely wanted the reader to feel a lot of things, even if some of what they felt was frustration at choices that I was making, but also, also just that sense of how there's no right way to be a woman. Like, so if you are a woman who finds yourself unhappy, what are your options as a woman who has found herself unhappy? And so I talk a lot about sort of the fetishization of self-destruction, which we see in media and film and literature, and which I myself have taken part in as a fiction writer. I mean, my first novel is about a very self-destructive young woman, and I think that was in the 90s, which was when I wrote that book, although it didn't get published until a bit later, but that was really in vogue. It was this sort of, Leslie Jameson writes about it in the empathy exams. It's this sort of, this swaggering, like, I'll self-immolate before you can do it to me. And like that, and somehow that will make me a badass, and it's like, well, you still end up wasted away or dead, or, and so I talk about that in the book, essentially that, we have these women who are willing to kind of subjugate their own needs to, to making other people happy. And that's very validated in our culture. But if you are not able to stay in that box, there are not a lot of templates for what you do next that doesn't end with you like riding off the Thelma and Louise cliff. And so, for me, that was a big struggle, like believing that you could go on after having made certain really profound mistakes, the belief that you could still find yourself worthy of, I don't mean a simplistic happy ending, but that you could be worthy of growth and change and a life beyond. And I think that that's really hard for a lot of women in our culture, for a lot of people in our culture.
Yeah. Well, and I think what you're really talking about, it's the one word I wrote in the margins several times, and I'd love to say now, is resilience. There's a tremendous spirit of resilience, both in your life, the writing of the book, and the spirit, the message, I think, is resilience. And it's an ideal segue, because my next question was going to be, and I'm going to read them backwards because this was the second quote, but the best compliment I think I can give you is that I had to try really hard to restrain myself, because this is a very quotable book, but I chose two that I wanted to read to you and have you comment on. But I'm going to read the second one that I wrote first, because it's so perfect from what you just said, which is, this becomes the moment that I refuse to join the endless body count of women lost to history. This dark night, I resolve to believe irrevocably, and whatever the cost, that I deserve to live.
Yeah. So first of all, I'm going to stand up because I'm in this crazy swath of sun, and no amount of moving the drum in front of me is helping me. So, but so if you'll forgive me, hold on, I'm going to just shift this chair.
Not at all. I've enjoyed the golden glow, but I know that from experience, it's a pain in the ass for the.
Hold on. So I really apologize for this little interruption to the program, but yes,
Not
that's
at
better
all.
now. I can actually see. Um, s- I got a letter, and you know, I don't do things like some people will post the letters that they get like without the person's name
Yeah.
on social media. I never do anything like that. You know, I view the letters that I receive as really sacred, just to me, even if the person who wrote them wouldn't mind. But I got a letter from someone who said that similarly to as I mentioned in the book, once she had had children, she realized that sort of the option of suicide was off the table because, she had children now and, the obligation to the children superseded the idea of like giving into that unhappiness. But she said she read that line and that it had never actually occurred to her to frame it in a sense that she deserved to live. And all I guess I will say about that is that if that was literally the only thing that ever happened as a result of my writing this book, uh, that would have been 8 million times more than enough.
Well, cheers to you. And again, I'm certain you will get more letters like that. And of course, we know how the world works. You're going to get, you're not going to get many letters from people who this book still helps in tremendous ways. So I don't feel the least bit self-conscious in heaping on the praise and saying again that, that is of course on one level what art aspires to do, but often falls short. But this notion of solidarity and courage, and again, yeah, for me, at times, and it wasn't uncomfortable, but it was at times a very painful read. At times, beautiful, laugh out loud. But the key, as I said earlier, the key takeaway for me was this notion of resilience, both in terms of the message of the book, but your message as a human being. So the other quote, which is applicable to everything we've been talking about, but to me, it really harkens back to this notion of, well, why would men, what could men get out of this? Which again is it's a dumb hypothetical, but I'm imagining certain types of readers are like, I don't read memoirs by women, which is, we could have a whole discussion about that, but specifically
About
my nudging toward why this particular book for any and all men. You write, it's dangerous to be a beautiful woman, even when you're sober and relatively sane. It's dangerous to be a woman, even if you're not beautiful at all. I'd love you to talk about that, but I'll just say, mic drop. Again, that's a line that a man could never write, should never comment on, but it's important for men to hear those words and understand that that's reality.
Well, it is reality. I mean, it's dangerous to be a woman. End of sentence. I think one of the things that interests me is how profoundly so many women, really almost all women, at least initially, and they may break free of it, but how strongly the culture leads women to believe that our lives will be better if we are beautiful and if we are desired and if we are the objects of desire. And what I have found actually, that I think is interesting and that is something I've kind of always in the back of my mind wanted to write an essay about is that some of the most, stunningly beautiful, the head turning women that I know, um, you know, it's like it can be like a beacon to predators, and so then, okay, so we could try to then make this argument of like, oh, female beauty, like we shouldn't pursue it, we shouldn't try to make ourselves desirable. But of course, there is this flip side where women who do not feel desirable, which of course also includes plenty of beautiful women, but women who don't feel desirable, women who feel like they are not meeting the standards of the culture, likewise can be preyed on by a different type of predator who feeds on insecurity, who feeds on this idea that, like, you know, you can't do better, where else would you have to go? And this sort of also, I think, radical misconception that somehow, you know, rape and sexual assault and sexual harassment even have anything to do with how desirable the woman is in some objective cultural standards, that they happen to everyone because all women are vulnerable to that. And, you know, and because men know it. And obviously there are men who are not in any way tempted to rape anybody and are not in any way tempted to sexually harass anybody. But if you are someone who is disposed in that way, you know, you can harass up and you can harass down and you can harass laterally, and like you can just, you know, no matter where you're looking, you can find women who have been told that they're not good enough by the culture, and who don't feel safe in themselves, who don't feel who don't feel like they can essentially have agency to prevent that. And on some level, it's, you know, on some level, sure, you can develop the strength and be like, fuck off, and you can all of that. But at the end of the day, it's that quote, you know, men are afraid women are going to laugh at them, and women are afraid men are going to kill them. I mean, and there it is, you know, it's like, so we all carry that around. I mean, there is not a woman who's doesn't get that pricking up her spine when she hears the footsteps behind her on the street, you know, in the dark, who doesn't immediately reach for the keys, you know, sticking one out of her finger. Like, that is just the condition of being a woman. It's also obviously, of course, open season on a lot of other people besides women in our culture. So, but just me speaking from my experience as a woman, it just doesn't seem as though, like, we're being fed this myth that somehow we're supposed to be competing for the gaze and competing for desirability, when in reality, you can't escape the gaze. You can't escape the trouble that the gaze can bring upon you, no matter what you look like and if you give a crap or not.
Right, right. And I think that leads us to circling back on something that we had talked a little bit about earlier, but I'd love for you to expound a little bit, because I think this is a really important part of the book too, and I think it's part of what I don't know how to, it's not this generation, right? Because there's writers of different ages, but I think what we're living through, you know, in the 21st century, and there's no going back, which is so wonderful. But this notion of women kind of reclaiming their right to be happy, you know, it's so fundamental. And let me set it up by saying, of course, you know, in America, much less the rest of the world, but in America, men have that problem. You know, we're all enculturated, we're all hassled by the man and yada yada. But I think, you know, we look back at the 50s and 60s and say, well, women didn't used to get divorced. And it's like, yeah, because they couldn't. Or imagine the books that weren't written, you know, that we can't enjoy, or the lives that were lived in quiet desperation. So for all the messiness that you articulate, and I think felt and feel guilt about, there's also your acknowledgement, which again, to me is a very heroic act, Gina. Your acknowledgement, you know what, but I'm alive. And if I'm going to be alive, I need to write, I need to be with the person I love, I need to be the best person for my kids and my students. And you reclaimed your right to that, which is, to me, it makes this a very happy, you know, it's a very happy book in that regard. But talk a little bit about, you know, we don't have to get into your life story so much as, you know, when you realized, or your path to realization, like, yeah, this life sucks sometimes, but damn it, I owe it to myself to be the best person I can be.
Well, I think that that line right there is everything, right? So
Yeah.
miserable people really have a very hard time being generous to others, being kind. Um, if you are consigned to living in misery and constant self-flagellation and self-punishment, in a sense, the world will forever revolve around how terrible you are. You are. I have this line in a essay I wrote years ago that had nothing to do with any of these things, but being the piece of shit at the center of the universe still puts you at the center of the universe.
Right.
And so, there does come a time. I mean, obviously, of course, we can't just run around hurting people, feeling no guilt, feeling no accountability. But it's also true, and this is one of the big things in the recovery community, which my husband is a part of, and I have many friends were part of. Um, you know, People do things that have caused them great shame, and sometimes those things are hardcore. I mean, beyond things that are in my book. Um, does it better serve the world for that person to languish forever in misery and believing themselves just irredeemable,
Right.
or does that essentially make them useless to other people because everything is revolving around their own self-conception and their shame? And so I think, for women in particular, and for mothers in particular, there is this sense of like, if you have made a mistake as a mother, now that mistake, I mean, in my case, I had an affair. My daughters found out about it, and I then didn't come clean to my ex-husband and allowed them to kind of carry this knowledge for several years. So, you know, I may look at that as the biggest mistake of my life, and obviously not a thing that in my mind, the good mother picture of my mind
Yeah.
would have done, right? And in some cases, it may be that, a woman suffered from addiction and wasn't able to care for her children. And, in some, like, there's any number of things that you may do that can brand you in your own mind or in the mind of society as a bad mother. And, well, what next? Like, and that's the thing for me, is that relationship is a constantly active, evolving thing. And so for me, it was extremely important to get beyond just sort of that writhing shame,
Mhm.
because what good is that writhing shame to my children, to the world, to anybody, right? I mean, not, and it's not good for me either. And that obviously is also relevant, because we get to believe as people, as women, that like we do deserve to exist, right? So I think that that letting go of so much shame that we may
Right.
feel as mothers, as women, as what, in whatever way we've transgressed what it means to be good, you don't just owe that to yourself so you can have some kind of utopian happy ending and like pat yourself on the back about how happy you are, but you owe it to the other people in your life, because happiness or peace or being able to look at yourself in the mirror is ultimately also a gift that you're giving to the other people in your life. And growing up with a thrashingly unhappy mother is, I think, not a thing that anyone in the world would make an argument as being good for kids.
Sure.
So
Sure. Well, thank you for that. Thank you for all of that. I can't help but say that, and I don't think your book doesn't male bash at all. I don't think, a shallow reading of feminism doesn't male bash, but from the books I've read, very generally speaking, the trajectory of kind of your famous male mea culpa is, yeah, I was useless to everyone for 10 years and, then I got better. And that's great. But I think what bears repeating is that your book is exhibit A, is even when women are feeling shame or, doing things that maybe they're not proud of or whatever is going on, most women you're feeling that shame and the societally constructed pressures all along. So I think that's kind of one of the reasons I mentioned that other quote earlier was, even when no one is judging, the woman's judging themselves. Of course, I'm not implying that men aren't capable or judging, but there's just a different standard. And I think what this memoir kind of celebrates implicitly is women are increasingly able to kind of express their agency, and society is kind of realizing, well, yeah, duh, it should have always been that way, but it has not been easy to come to fruition, and we've got a long way to go. But
and I think people our age, there is a lot of danger in thinking that things are unstoppable trains, because we've seen that that's not always true. So whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's feminism, there can be a certain momentum, and then everyone's like, oh wow, that's great, like look at that thing go, now it's gonna go to its end point. But it's always a few steps forward and then a couple miles back. And I think the Trump presidency was an illustration of that, right? In terms of race in this country, that you get to this point of victory, and then there's this sort of incredibly reductive and grotesquely untrue idea that like, oh, now we're a post-racial culture.
yeah.
And no, it turns out now we're going to put some people in cages at the border, and we're going to shoot a bunch of Black people, including children. And so I think that's dangerous for women as well. I mean, the Me Too movement has been mostly a movement that, has been widely publicized within the realm of celebrity, within the realm of privilege. I don't know how much it's impacting the lives of women on the ground who, don't have resources. I don't know that anyone's talking about that at all. Just like second wave feminism had literally zero impact on my old neighborhood. So I think that those of us who maybe consumers of social media and of books and so forth, like, we think everyone's talking about something,
Right.
but not everyone's talking about it.
Right. Well, so, to me, works like Blow Your House Down and the better examples of, memoir and how I think something else to celebrate is I think we're seeing kind of, well, first of all, art's always in flux, but memoir, I think writers used to kind of confine to the parameters of what was accepted as the form. And I think what we're increasingly seeing is writers are expanding the form to fit their message. And I think that's liberating for both reader and writer. But a book like yours stays read. So I like to look at these things through the lens of, it is a long game. And we can get hung up on the myriad injustices and intolerable inequity. But the macro or the micro view is one person is, one heart and mind at a time. And books like this you're not going to read a book like this and look at feminism the same way. And by, I think, extension, you're not going to look at Black Lives Matter the same way. You're not going to look at arts the same way. And that's pushing us closer to where we need to be.
And just to that end, I always like to plug this so that people will explore this organization beyond my book. So I am donating the royalties for Blow Your House Down to an organization called Deborah's Place in Chicago, which works with women who are facing homelessness. And they've been around for decades. They are a grassroots organization with an amazing track record of keeping women off the streets. Once you enter Deborah's Place, you're on a new trajectory. And so I really wanted this book to be able to have some amount of impact in the lives of people whose most urgent matter is not reading a book, particularly during COVID, where 75% of the workforce that's been, that's lost their jobs have been women. And so if you already own the book, or if you have no desire to read the book, like, go check out Deborah's Place anyway and make a donation to them, because they're doing amazing work.
I think that's a perfect note to end on, in the sense that it summarizes everything that I know about you, both as a writer and as a human being, Gina. I want to thank you for being a writer. I want to thank you for writing this book. And I want to thank you for just being the kind of human being. I mean, whether we're talking about COVID, or, we all could talk about the fact that most writers were dealing with rejection and solitude a great deal of the time. It's always refreshing and very inspiring to come across the types of writers that you just want to succeed. You want to share their work. You want them to reach a wide readership for a million reasons, because the work is worthy, but because that the people reading the book are going to have their lives improved. So for all of those and other things, and for taking the time, you're very busy right now. You're very important to me in the 1455. We could talk for another couple of hours, but this is not our first rodeo, and it shall not be our last rodeo. So as I'm fond of saying in this series, as hackneyed as it is, it's like once I pull you in, you're not getting out.
I'm glad to be in.
Yay. Well, I will give the final word to you and say whatever you want, but I will just simply say, again, reminder, I'll put all the information on the 1455 page, on our Facebook page. We'll make it very easy. You can definitely support independent bookstores by going right to the Potter's House. You can go to Gina's home website, which I'll put a link up, etc. But if it's not sufficiently clear, I adore this writer, I adore this book, and I strongly encourage you to spread the word. It's something to celebrate in what's been a very difficult year, but it points us toward the light.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. And, I am very honored by the things that you've said.
Well, absolutely my pleasure. But seriously, this is never a job, because I get to read and talk to writers, but there are some events that are more meaningful than others, and this was very meaningful to me. So again, I thank you, and we will see you soon.
Absolutely.
All right, Gina, go knock them dead. Continued success, and take care of yourself. But enjoy the ride. You deserve it.
Thank you.
All right, sister. Talk soon.
Bye.
Bye.